hear from me. We have such an impressive group of panelists and speakers who are ready to fire up this conversation. So I want to get straight to the point. And before we kick off the conversation, I'd like to introduce the IMF's Deputy Managing Director, who is a dual national of Brazil and Italy and oversees all the IMF's administrative functions. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Managing Director Carla Grasso to the stage. Hello.
Salamat siang, and thank you for the introduction, Ahmed. I am delighted to see you again at the annual meetings as the moderator of this important panel discussion. I was delighted to see you already on Sunday morning when the IMF annual meetings team joined with the Indonesian authorities and the Nusa Dua Reef Foundation to help replant a part of the Indonesia coral reef. For me, it was a wonderful experience working together in support of the environment with many volunteers. Ahmed was one of the volunteers, and to contribute to a better and sustainable planet for the next generations. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to all of you in the room and to those watching the live webcast. Let me start by recognizing the 4 winners of the 2018 Asian Youth Instagram Photo Contest. Please stand up. Applauses. Theirs and the other contenders' photos have been showing on the screens. I would also like to welcome the university students from Pendidikan Ganesha and Udayana attending our event today. Let's take a closer look at the situation facing young people around the world. In 2008, the global economy was hit by a crisis that affected the lives of millions across the globe. Young people were hit particularly hard, as can be seen by the sharp rise in youth unemployment. In Indonesia, as in much of the world, challenges to employment remain. Indonesian youth unemployment stands at 15.6%, which is slightly above the global average 13.5%, which is high. In regions such as the Middle East and North Africa, youth unemployment runs at nearly 30% in many countries. Globally, more than 1 in 5 young people is not employed or receiving education or training. Most of them are women. Clearly, there is room for improvement. But how can this be achieved? First, we can start by looking at the quality of jobs available for young people and ways to adapt labor markets to the needs of the youth. According to the ILO, 3 out of 4 people employed around the world are working in the informal sector. More effort is needed to open the routes for youth to join the formal sector, including through education and lowering barriers to formal employment. Second, technology can open new paths for young people. Some studies have shown that artificial intelligence and automation may displace people in the labor markets, but AI will also create many new jobs. According to the World Economic Forum, in the next 4 years, more than 75 million jobs may be lost as companies shift to more automation. But the same projections have an upside. 133 million new jobs will emerge during the same time period as businesses develop a new division of labor between people and machines. It is therefore essential to educate our youth to be ready to take advantage of the technological revolution and fulfill their potential. Finally, we have to take a broader perspective to look at the issue. Often, young people are particularly affected by fundamental challenges like conflicts and instability, climate change, and corruption. We all have a responsibility, especially policymakers, to build the foundations for a stable and prosperous future. Today, we have an insightful panel that will discuss how to best address the current trends in labor markets and identify what young people need to get quality jobs. Young people, with their skills and positive energy, can be a huge asset. We need to provide them with the right tools and opportunities to shape the world in the future. So, thank you, Terima kasih.
So, apakah kamu bangun? Okay, so I'm not so bad. That's good. I'm just making sure we're all awake and ready for this conversation. Some quick housekeeping notes. The session is going to run for just an hour, which isn't a lot of time, and I want to make sure this is an interactive experience. We want you to participate as well as our audience that are watching in our live webcast. So remember, if you have any questions, you'll have a chance to ask questions directly to the panelists. And for those of you who are watching online, you can always use the hashtag IMFYouth. So without further ado, two questions that we want to answer, at least in my opinion. I'm very curious to know, what do we actually know about what is working when it comes to youth unemployment? And what is the big question mark, in terms of the shifts that we've seen, not just on the national level, but on the global level? So without further ado, joining us to discuss this is, well, an esteemed panel, Dr. Vjosa Osmani, who's now serving her third mandate as a member of parliament in Kosovo. She chairs the Committee for Foreign Affairs, Diaspora, and Strategic Investment. She also teaches international law courses both in Kosovo and the US. I'm going to speak quickly because this isn't the interesting part, although, of course, your bio is very interesting. Ahmed Zaki, next. We have the founder and chief executive officer of Bukalapak, one of the leading online marketplaces, for those of you who don't know, in Indonesia and really in the world, a unicorn company valued at $1 billion. And in 2016, it's worth mentioning, Ahmed Zaki received, I'm going to mess this pronunciation up, but the Satya Lankana Wirakarya badge. He's laughing. You can laugh too. It's okay. So it's really a prestigious honor that was awarded by the Indonesian president. Next, we have Anneli. She's Anneli Makuzo. I've had the chance to get to know her in the last 2 days. The founder and managing director of AEI, the African Entrepreneurship Initiative, which is 100% Black woman-owned. She is also, I should say, AEI is a consulting and entrepreneurship education training company. It has a focus on youth within the African continent, and she's also in Bali as one of the fellows here at the IMF Youth Fellowship Program. Next, we have Aya Shebi, also a fellow here with the IMF. She's an award-winning Pan-African feminist, renowned blogger, and a Tunisian activist. She's the founder of the Africa Youth Movement. She currently sits on the board of directors of things I can't pronounce, but I will try. Civicus, is that correct? Fantastic. The World Refugee Council, Oxfam's Independent Commission as well on sexual misconduct, and the Advisory Committee of Frida Young Feminist Fund. And last, but certainly not least, and just to put you in the picture, you might guess he's the oldest on this stage, but you might be wrong, is Graham Buckley. That's why you shouldn't assume things. Director of the ILO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Before joining the ILO, he spent 7 years working as an economic advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Department of International Development of the United Kingdom. He's also served many assignments in several countries, including China, as a country economist. So, without further ado, Graham, maybe we can start with you. I wanted to kind of get a macro picture of trends when it comes to labor markets for youth. The ILO estimates, as I'm sure you know, that there are 71 million young people unemployed in 2017. That's actually well below the crisis peak back in 2009, which was 76.7 million. So kick us off with kind of your assessment when it comes to youth employment trends at large.
Thank you very much. I think right at the beginning, Carla provided a very good overview, a very good picture of the state of employment for young people. Of course, as every good economist knows, where you end up in terms of data depends on where you start from. And yes, the figures that were just quoted do indicate that there is an improvement in terms of youth employment since the peak period a couple of years after the crisis. But then if one looks at the data for a few years before the onset of the crisis, there are actually higher levels of employment for young people. But I would think that one of the most important things to outline is that the experience of young people in the workplace is defined only partially by figures concerning unemployment and employment. And we need to be careful not to look at young people as a homogeneous group. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it's not just about the numbers of people working or not working. It's also a question of looking at what people are actually doing at the workplace, and in particular looking at the quality of the work that they're doing, the quality of jobs. And I think there's some indication to suggest that although employment rates for young people in some places might be improved over recent years, we have to consider what type of work they're doing. A lot of the work that young people are doing these days is casual, it's short-term, it's temporary. It's working often in the informal economy. Approximately 3/4 of all young people are working in the informal economy. We know the statistics that I think roughly for every one unemployed person, there are 3 young unemployed people. So in other words, there is far greater probability that young people will be unemployed compared to older people. And also I think we have to consider, as I mentioned, youth not as a homogeneous group, but made up of many, many different groups. So the work experience will vary depending on where the young people are living, in which part of the world, whether they're living in rural or urban areas. And of course, there's a huge challenge if you have an added challenge in terms of, for example, coming from particular ethnic groups, if you have a disability or whatever. So one has to be, I think, fairly cautious about looking at young people as a homogeneous group.
Graham, if you don't mind, if I can just ask you to clarify something that, 5 million less people unemployed in just under 10 years, what can you attribute that to, just on a macro scale? Is that...
I think, as I mentioned, one of the things you have to look at is the quality of that employment. So I think that a lot of people, or indeed, more people are finding jobs, but those jobs are often temporary, they're often casual, they're often short-term, they're often vulnerable types of jobs, people in precarious employment relationships and so on. So one has to be careful to look at the quality of that employment. But I think it's also very important as well to look at participation rates, and that gives you a broader picture. And if you look at the last 20 years or so, labour force participation rates for young people have gone down from about 55% to about 45%. What does this indicate? This indicates to some extent that people perhaps are staying in education longer.
Yeah.
It also indicates potentially that there are a lot more NEETs, people that are not in employment, education or training. I think about 22% of young people are classified as NEETs globally at the moment, and I think roughly 3/4 of all of those are women. So I think that you have to look a little bit more in a nuanced way at the labour market rather than those headline figures.
So Graham, thanks for that overview. Obviously, government policy is very important when we talk about trying to close this gap, and I want to get to some of the specifics with you, Dr. Vjosa. How welcoming would you say is the labour market for young people, specifically in your country and region?
Let me first start by saying how happy I am in this beautiful and very hospitable country. It's great to be among all of you, especially the students. A special welcome to them. And then going back to your question, obviously, no matter how many great ideas you might have among entrepreneurs and the business people, you always need a government that is interested to support that through policy. And it is the job of the parliaments, especially in those countries that democracy functions, that parliament functions to push those governments to adopt and implement those policies, because throughout these couple of days that we've been discussing among ourselves, we've seen that there's a huge gap between what legislation that is adopted says and what's the reality in the ground. For example, my country scores almost 100% in really exciting report that was recently published by the World Bank. It's called Women, Business and the Law. But then when we look, for example, on property rights and how much young women can inherit and how much they can use that property, but when we look at the reality in the ground, that only 6% of women in Kosovo actually do inherit anything in practice. So this leaves them with a very difficult situation to either finance their businesses or to get loans in order to be economically powerful and independent. My country, which is in Southeastern Europe, has the youngest population in Europe. Over 70% of the people are under 30, which is quite a huge potential and quite a big human capital because we're in an aging continent. Practically almost every other country in Europe has an aging population except for Kosovo. But if you do not have proper policies for the labor market, that can become quite a big burden. So we're trying to change that, and although I'm currently in the opposition, I'm trying to champion initiatives that create joint efforts of both the opposition, the government, the parliament, and the private sector that can last. So sustainability in policies is extremely important because we cannot have a positive effect with only one government in place. It needs to last so that we can have actual success in the ground.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of jump around because I want to make sure that this is a dynamic conversation and give everyone a chance to respond. I saw actually Anneli and Zaki, you were both nodding as she was making her points. So I would imagine, Anneli, that you agree with what she's saying.
Yes, I do agree, and I will take, because I'm from South Africa, so in our context, we know that in terms of entrepreneurship, there's a big case study that entrepreneurship provides the most jobs. And currently, in the first quarter of 2018, South Africa was sitting at 38.2% of unemployed youth. So there's definitely a drive for entrepreneurship to be introduced to the youth. But the biggest challenge becomes that we can't say to the youth, they must be entrepreneurs when there is no enabling environment. And
That's the role of the government.
And one of the pillars, well, they play a huge role, a center role in that, is that we need policies that enhance entrepreneurship. So we need tax policies. We need a technology infrastructure. We need access to markets. We need access to funding. So we need the World Bank and the IMF to kind of help us lobby for those policies. And I'm glad Kosovo is taking such a stand on, because that is going to be a great case study for us to look at. And how do you implement these policies and how do you drive sustainable entrepreneurship? Because at the moment in South Africa, you have up to 80% of startups fail between 2 and 3 years. So there's definitely something's not working. We don't have that environment.
Well, and I want to talk more about the actual unemployment rate in South Africa, how that factors in, but because you mentioned the private sector as well and collaborating, Zaki, I want to ask you, I mean, you are the CEO of Bukalapak. So it's an e-commerce platform, but I know it's a lot more than that. I'm learning, as we go here. And I want to know, one important factor that you hear time and time again when we talk about the global economy is technology, the role of technology, technological advancement. How would you say technology is affecting opportunities or the nature of jobs? Is it all positive?
Yeah, I see, because I myself a technologist. I myself changed because of technology. I start as a computer science, and I never imagined my company can be big as now. I imagine like maybe when I'm 50, my company will be big. But right now I'm 32 and my company is already big, and I think the role of technology technology play very important role in my career, because technology bring equality. For example, like I think 2011, my current investor, they used to be not my investor, email me through LinkedIn or Facebook. It's amazing, because before 2011, I cannot get the access. How to find an investor? But they come to us through Facebook and LinkedIn. I think it's amazing, and more to come to contact me and invest in Bukalapak and grow the company. I think technology can give an opportunity for youth to have to be more competitive than older generation, because right now it's changing so fast, and the more you young, the better. I think that's my view.
The younger, the better.
Yeah, I think that's my.
Sorry,
I have 2,000. Yeah, I have 2,000 people in my company, and most of them is in average 25.
So
I always hire a younger generation.
But don't they have less experience?
No, it's if you are let's say 40 or 50, your brain already full. It's very hard. Yeah. it's very hard to be filled with new knowledge. But
if you're young, isn't your brain empty?
yeah, it's empty. That's why I prefer empty brain because it's much better to be filled with new things, to be filled with new innovation, something like that. I think that's.
And sorry to interrupt
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
but it seems like you're sparking a lot of ideas. I want to hear from other people, and feel free to
Yeah,
jump
okay,
back in. No, just a point. Didn't you start your company in a dorm room, like in college?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like you're like
When I was college. Yeah.
so you're like the Asian Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, if sorry.
Similar stories, maybe.
I mean, if you look at the trend, maybe all of you know Disney, right? Disney built company 20 years or 50 years.
Yeah.
Of Henry Ford, something like that. But right now, the young generation build company faster. I think that's a very beautiful trend.
I agree with you on that, at least. Aya, I know we haven't heard from you. You wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we wish to have that mentality in Africa because the average age of African leaders is 66 years old in a continent.
Aya, sorry, could you put the microphone closer a little bit or just hold
Can you
it?
hear me?
Can you hear her? Yeah? Okay, there you
Can
go.
you hear me?
Go ahead, continue.
I was saying the average age of African leaders is 66 years old in a continent that has 70% under 30. So we have 44 years at least a gap. So people don't really think that the younger the better. They think the older, the more serious.
I want to ask you about other trends that affect all of these statistics, such as migration. Coming from the Middle East, I know there's a brain drain effect, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, nodding in respective regions. They have similar things. But because Dr. Viose, you wanted to jump into some of what Zaki was saying.
Just to absolutely echo the fact that although youth might have less experience, they do bring the kind of resilience, the enthusiasm, and the energy that especially the young, the new businesses need. But even in politics, I mean, you can see that in political parties. Those that close the doors to the young people are doomed to fail and lose election after election. Only if you are so open to the new ideas, to the energy that the institutions need, and they, of course, we send through political parties, we send that energy that the young can bring, that you can actually look up for success.
And to your point, you talk about young people bringing enthusiasm. Graham, when we were meeting yesterday just to discuss this, you mentioned that young people often have technical skills, but they lack soft skills, or they lack skills such as collaboration, networking. How does that factor in, and how can we remedy that? Is it important to focus on those soft skills?
Yes, it is. I think it's very important. But if I just could
go back
to an earlier point about technology, I think obviously we all know about the role of technology and the future of work, how this will change the nature of the jobs that people do. And clearly technology is an opportunity for many, and perhaps particularly for young people. But I think it's also important to recognize that technology can also be a threat. And in some places, technology may well serve to polarize the labor market. And I think it's very important that governments are cognizant of that.
When you talk about a threat, are you referring to like automation, or?
I'm referring to partly automation and partly to taking away jobs that would otherwise be done by humans. But I'm also inferring as well that technology may change the nature of the workplace relationship and the conditions of work.
Yeah.
We see, for example, the platform economy, the gig economy, presents a huge amount of opportunities, both for consumers and for workers, but in many places one can question the quality of the employment generated. And I think that, for example, a lot of people working on the platform economy, working in the gig economy, may well have few opportunities to access social protection, for example, and the nature of their employment may be somewhat insecure. So I think one has to be sort of quite careful to recognize that technology is a great opportunity, but also for some people it may be a threat, and I think it's an opportunity that needs to be managed by government and to ensure that it does lead to equitable outcomes.
Aya?
Yeah, but I think also it's not accessible for everyone. So if we're talking about technology and praising a lot technology now and putting a lot of hope on technology solving a lot of problems, half of the world is offline and 70% of Africa is offline. So if we're talking about the disruption of technology, I think the disruption is not necessarily in its innovation, but in its accessibility. The more it's accessible to the citizen, to the refugee, to the IDP, to the migrant, the more it can has more effect. But just want to get back to not your question, but 2 points that I don't want us to not look at in the discussion. One is that there are 2 questions I think we sometimes overlook when talking about youth at work. The first is that to ask youth, what do you want? What do you want to work? We oftentimes try to analyze the market and analyze the education system and try to match. Basically, we have demand and we want to provide the supply for the demand. But we see more and more young graduates who graduate in something and go and work something completely different.
Right.
Is it because of the mismatch, or is it because we did not ask them, what do you want to work? And we're not trying to actually create the demand that meets the needs of young people.
Right.
And the second question is, after we understand what do you want to work, we need to ask them why. And the why is important because it's about purpose. And I say this from a decade of experience working with young people in 40 African countries. This generation is questioning its purpose.
Yeah.
And while this generation is busy trying to find answers to who they are and what's their purpose, we are busy trying to reduce the unemployment rate.
Yeah.
And we are busy trying to provide more jobs, hire as many young people as possible in corporations, make everyone entrepreneur and part of the capitalist neoliberal system. That's what we're trying to do.
Right.
But we're telling them what to be an entrepreneur, be a leader, be this, be that. But let the youth be the hell whatever they want to be.
Yeah. No, it's the youth. So the youth agree with Aya. I think that's good. No, but I often find that on a philosophical level, we don't spend enough time questioning the motivation behind wanting to find jobs, wanting to be an entrepreneur. We were talking a little bit about this, Anela. I know you wanted to chime in on the issue of...
Yeah, so I think one of the things to touch on what I said is that the youth want autonomy. So however that looks in terms of I want to find a job, I want to be an entrepreneur, they want autonomy and they want purpose, which is great. But then we need to create environments where they can choose what they want to be. So whether you want to be an entrepreneur or you want to be employed, there are opportunities there for you to become those things. And just on the technological aspect, it's that technology is an enabler. That's what it does. It gives access to people. And if we're not cognizant of how are we making technology inclusive, we are further excluding people from the economy, especially the youth.
When you talk about inclusive, is it an expense kind of thing? Because I know you mentioned to me in South Africa,
Definitely.
Some people don't have the money to spend on internet access.
Yes, cost is part of it. So in South Africa, we pay almost around an average of $10 for 1 gigabyte of data. So if you're looking at how much that is and what the average population earns in South Africa, people can't access technology. And what we found with a recent study is that what youth are actually using their data for is uploading CVs.
Yeah.
So if that's where we're going, that means that, again, we're excluding a lot of the youth, whether they want to participate or not.
And Zaki, does that ring true? I saw you were nodding as Aneli was talking, but what can we do to get more young people with empty brains in companies like yours?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know, our education system looks like it's old, obsolete product. I think so many people try to fill the brain of the young generation with certain, this is the right things.
Something outdated,
yeah.
maybe?
No, I mean, yeah, something outdated. If in real life, it's not like that. Maybe the number of planets, I think I remember it's 9, but right now 8 and then 12. I don't know, it's always changing. Why we teach something like that? We have to teach creativity, don't teach too much of content, teach less, but more flexible in learning for the youth. I think is very important.
So you think education reform is a big part of this?
Yeah, I think big problem. We have a very, very big problem in education.
Oh, in your region, or you think it's a global issue?
I think it's global. We try to centralize everything because right now it's decentralized, the trend. Why we centralize everything to education system? We have to make it more liberal.
And as a professor, I mean, you're obviously involved in the education system on a higher kind of level. How big a factor in your experience when governments are trying to, implement policies to solve some of the unemployment when it comes to youth, do they take into consideration, reforming an education system? That seems like a very big task for a government.
It is a big task, but those that don't take that into consideration fail, because we've seen it also with the Human Capital Index that the IMF will be publishing tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, that education is the biggest pillar of it. You cannot expect to have youth at work and to create a workforce that is successful and has access to technology if you're not investing in education at early ages. So yes, I do teach at the highest level, at university level, but I have two little kids, twins, that are at kindergarten. They are 4.5, and I can see that that is actually the most important stage. And Dr. Kim today was precisely pointing out how important for the future of that young person, both in terms of health, but also education, and how successful you will be in your life are the first 1,000 days of your life. So we need to absolutely invest in education. And in terms of costs, one of the things that we're trying to do is what is called youth budgeting. So practically every single piece of legislation that comes to the parliament, and this is something that we're piloting in our region, we do both gender budgeting and youth budgeting. So we'll look at the law from the point of view of how much the projects that are supported by that piece of legislation are actually supporting youth, both in the labor market, in education, and also all sorts of fronts. So that is extremely important for governments in order to make sure that you don't just adopt one strategy and then leave it there in your drawer, but to make sure that youth is taken into account, projects supporting youth are taken into account in every law that is passed.
And Graham and I want to get your thoughts on this, the topic of education, but I just want to get a quick sense. How many students are in the audience? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so a fair amount. And with your hand still raised, do you think that education is the biggest issue when it comes to youth unemployment? We have one person who agrees. Great. Because on Twitter, we put out a poll, and it's very interesting that this came up. I just want to segue. We asked, can you let us know the biggest challenges facing youth when looking for a job? And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, 38% said outdated education systems, which is exactly what we're talking about here. And just to mention quickly, the second most mentioned issue was skills that are uneven with the market, which was 36%. So with that,
which, if I may add, also relates to education.
Right.
Because if you're getting educated for skills that do not match the market, that's a big problem.
And that's what Zeki mentioned, right. So Graham, education in your perspective on a macro scale, I mean, what is the incentive for governments to actually bring about those reforms?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big conundrum. I think it's misleading to think that more education is necessarily better in terms of preparing people for the labour market in general. Obviously, it depends a lot on the particular sector and where in the economy we are talking about. You asked or raised a question, Ahmed, earlier on, which I didn't answer, about soft skills.
Sure.
I think that the very fact that there are so many graduates of tertiary education who are unemployed, in Thailand, where I am coming from, I think 1/3 of all unemployed people are highly skilled graduates. This would clearly indicate that it's not just a question of more education equals more opportunities to work, but it's a question of actually matching what the private sector, industry, commerce, business wants with what is coming out of schools and universities. And I think that's where there is often a challenge. And it's partly because in many cases, the education system hasn't moved with times. In many cases, the skills that employers are calling for these days are, in addition to the technical skills, there are the soft skills of creativity, collaboration, creative thinking and so on, which are not necessarily easy to impart and are often not part of standard curricula in schools and in universities.
Yeah, and Aya, because you mentioned migrants and refugees earlier, and I know that in our region, the Middle East, North Africa, there's obviously a whole series of problems and challenges, but around 70%, for those of you who don't know, according to the ILO, the bulk of international migrant flows consists mostly of young people. Around 70% are younger than 30, and many of them are obviously from your region. What do you think are the primary reasons for that migration, and how do we stop the brain drain from happening?
Can I jump on education first?
Yes, why not?
I would like to again, challenge that because I want to bring back our conversation to purpose. It's not about access to education or better education or the skills matching the market. I'll take the example of Tunisia. We have over 90% a population that is educated, higher education. We have the highest rate in Africa. And yet, in 2011, we had 7,000 young people who were radicalized in Daesh. These people are middle class. These people are potential entrepreneurs and doctors and teachers and engineers and computer scientists. Were they in Daesh to look for employment? No, they were looking for purpose because Daesh offers a transnational identity. Daesh has no visa restriction. Daesh has 30 plus languages and 80 plus citizenship. So I think we need, if you don't teach me as a student confidence, as a woman, I cannot stand up here and say and speak up for myself.
Well, and to your point, Aya, I mean, when you say if you don't teach me that, that could be part of education reform.
No, it is education, but I'm saying
Right.
I don't think we have to look at everything about in relation to market. We're too much stuck in like get youth to employment, get to the market, you know, meet the demand and reduce the rate of unemployment. I'm talking about getting back to who we are and what do we do as humans.
Right.
And getting back to have purpose of why we do what we do.
Right, and for those people who are educated, as you said, just to tie it to the migrant flow, if you're educated and you come out of work and you can't find a job, I mean, I would imagine that that's the motivation for leaving because there's this frustration. I mean, you're saying that they join Daesh, but for those who don't join Daesh, they probably leave the
Well, for those who don't join Daesh, they die in the Mediterranean. Because for me, the question is not why young people leave our region, is why young people die in the Mediterranean. Why a 20 years old would choose to jump on a boat, a tiny boat with 500 other people, knowing and willingly getting there, knowing that it will sink midway. Why? So, you know, the news put it out there as on the headlines as the deadliest of all time every time we have a boat sinking. But every time for us is every single day.
So
it's an emergency situation.
Of course. One of several crises, I mean, that we're discussing here. But Anneli, when you hear that...
But I think it's, sorry to interrupt, I think it's a tragedy that no one cares about. And it's a tragedy that it's not getting the attention of, you know, whether it's this kind of policy space, whether it's, you know, other spaces, people are not discussing that. And people just want to know why people leave our countries and how do we stop them from moving. We all know why people move, to get better job, to get better education, to get better opportunity, to run away from a war they didn't start.
Right.
But the essential question for us is why people willingly die,
right,
even though they have education and even though they have opportunity.
Well, right, but if they had opportunities, they would stay.
I don't think so.
I think, well, okay, perhaps. We can all agree to disagree, but I appreciate your passion. And Anneli, hearing what she's saying, I mean, talking about purpose, in your experience in South Africa, does that factor in? Is it about purpose or a lack thereof?
So, anyway, just to acknowledge, and I think it's important what's happening in the region, but at the moment we also need to acknowledge that there's youth in this room who want work, who want entrepreneurship. So we also need to discuss that as a matter of fact. And I think in South Africa, you want to, whether it's in South Africa, it's in the continent, in the world, I think everybody wants purpose, but they also want to provide for themselves. They want to earn a living. They want to participate in the economy. I think one thing we strive for is to be better off than the previous generation, whether it is financially, whether it's freedom, whether we want that kind of thing. So in our country, we don't have migration. So the youth doesn't have that opportunity to leave or the luxury of choosing to leave. So they have to stay there and make means with what they're doing. And I think entrepreneurship has become a big viable option for the youth in our country. But also we need to be careful about that because we can't use entrepreneurship as a buzzword.
Well, it really does feel like a buzzword. I mean, I hate to be dismissive, but whenever I hear about Africa in terms of like reforms, it's always, well, they're entrepreneurship, and it seems sometimes like a tokenized.
It is for the most part, because if you're looking at 80% failure rate, that means we're just telling people to be an entrepreneur, but not supporting them when they become an entrepreneur.
So what can we learn from how you are supporting them through your organization?
So through my organization, I do
have you learned?
enterprise development, and we provide soft skills, like Graham mentioned, which are, what you find with youth is that they have great ideas, great products or services, which is a technical skill, but do not know anything about running a business. And that's a totally different thing. So when you teach entrepreneurship, you need to start at what is design thinking, what is creativity, what is innovation, how do you identify a market, who's your customer, all those elements, and then introduce mentorship, introduce business coaching, so holistically they have support in how they can succeed and be sustainable going forward.
And, does that ring true to you, what Annelie's outlining? Is that really?
Yes, to a great extent, but also getting back to what I was saying. While, much of it might be true for Tunisia, I think we need to take into account that in most countries, if we're seeing IDPs and refugees and people immigrating, is because they have no other choice. And that is the truth. I've been an IDP and a refugee myself. My family and myself have gone through a horrible war, an attempted genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And we didn't leave our home because we wanted to or we lacked purpose. We left because we were forced to, or else we would be killed. And this is the truth for most cases, especially for refugees, of course. But I would agree that except for talking to youth about how they need to do this, this, and that because they need a job, they absolutely need hope and inspiration. I've seen that in my country. I mean, I'm going to need a minute.
Please.
I grew up in an apartheid-like system. I was not allowed to go to school just because I was Albanian, just because I belonged to a certain group. My parents were not allowed to work. We were not allowed even to play sports or go to a cultural event. And at that time, I had more hope than my students today. They haven't gone through those difficult times. So absolutely, we need to talk about purpose. We need to give them inspiring examples. And that is why they need to hear from people like you. And that is why even politicians need to lead by example, because that makes those young people not just stay and contribute to their countries, but also become global citizens and contribute to the rest of the world. But there's also one more important thing, especially for those that have gone through hell. It's mental health. So it's not just education that helps us create good human capital and create people that can contribute to the society, but also it's investment in health, and not just physical health, but it's also mental health, so they can overcome difficult periods and then become successful and, of course, find their purpose and everything else.
All right, so we have about 15 minutes, lots of questions on Twitter, but are there any questions in the audience? Okay, great. We'll be coming to you in just one second. Before we do, see what I did there? I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of something that I think has been addressed, but maybe not, we didn't discuss it at the length that we could. Someone responded to our Twitter poll that we put out that I referenced earlier. Her name's Mariam Al-Mansouri. She said, tying the two top answers together, the outdated education system goes hand in hand with the uneven skills to match the market, as you said, since youth spend so much of their time on educational grounds, schools and universities, which sadly focuses on textbooks rather than a creative and growing mindset. Now that kind of also refers to what Aya was mentioning about being inspired. Zeki, you must have been inspired in that dorm room when you created this company or when you started to. What can you share with us about your experience that maybe can be instructive to the young people here in this audience about creativity and technology?
Yeah, I come from a village in Central Java, and I don't know, I read a book about Montessori education, but looks like, whoa, this is, when I was in village, this is Montessori because I swim in the river, I play with muddy, something like that, paddy, muddy, something.
So if you want to have $1 billion company, swim in the river.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, and I live with poor community, and I'm very, I have a strong gratitude because I have a very good education. I went to one of the best university in Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's why I want to create something that very meaningful to the rest of the bottom 80%, because I believe the bottom 80% need help from the top 1%. So we have to give back what we already get from the skill and money or everything. That's why I agree with Aya say that purpose is very important.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I saw in my company, the most performing people, the most performing young generation, they have a strong why. They always asking why.
Yeah.
Why I have to do this?
Yeah.
Why I have to come to the office? If they have a strong why, they will have a strong motivation and they will work hard for it. Even I don't ask them, they will come in the morning and then go back late night. I think purpose is very important. We have to teach our kids since early to try to ask them why.
And we're going to get straight to the questions. We have about 10, 15 minutes left. I just want to ask something that you were mentioning about, we've talked about the role of government, how it's really important. We've talked about the private sector. We've talked about education reform. We've talked about a lot of things. But I'm curious, when we talk about governments, at least in the Middle East, something that is, I think, true also here in this region, I would imagine in maybe Africa as well, because we were talking about it last night, in governments, the youth might not be taken into account or are misrepresented because, quite frankly, governments tend to be run by people who are over 50 or over 60 or, sadly, in some situations, over 87. And,
Yeah, agree.
92.
not to be discriminatory towards, senior citizens, but how important is it and how can we bring younger people into those key decision-making roles in the government? Is that happening in Kosovo, for example?
To some extent, the key effort should be made in reforming political parties, because then the people from the political parties get to the government. So if within a big political party, an important one that has prospects of winning elections, you don't have youth at the table, you don't have youth part of the decision making, obviously are only probably just used to get the votes. But if they're not part of the decision making, then obviously you're not going to see them as ministers either. We're changing that slowly. My party is the oldest, for example, in Kosovo, the first anti-communist party in former Yugoslavia, but it's work in progress. These are reforms that need to be taken from bottom up instead of just thinking that you can do everything at the top.
Anelia, anything to add about this issue or anything else?
I think it is about reforming the parties, because in South Africa now the problem we have is that the barriers to entry are the government officials themselves. So as youth, they don't want to give you access because you don't have struggle credentials. So you weren't doing their struggle credentials. So if you weren't there fighting apartheid, then you're not going to sit at the table.
Right.
And if you do sit at the table, it's a tick box exercise. It's like, okay, we've got a black female, we've got a young youth person, and you be the token person there. So I think that there's young people rising up to that because we want our voices heard, because if they're not heard, how are they making decisions for us and for us to go forward?
And obviously, Africa movement, a lot of the efforts and initiatives that you work on try and actually mobilize young people and put them in these positions and create new parties. Do you feel like we can actually address this problem without that happening, without younger people being in decision-making roles?
I think it's absurd that the majority of the continent is not in power. It just doesn't make sense. And the ironic part is that the people who are in power now, they were in their 30s when they took power in the 50s and 60s, but they just stayed there, overstayed. So I think from a social movement perspective, our approach is to claim our space. So we occupy all the African Union meetings, all the national discussion, all the policy spaces. And then little by little you push for youth voices to be at the table.
Fantastic. So forgive me, I just want to make sure we do get some questions in. So who has a question and who has the microphone? There we go. We're going to come to that lady right there. Yeah, you. The microphone's coming straight to you. And then someone else, another microphone to this gentleman. And then we'll get 3 questions all at once. You, sir, this man. Yeah. Yes, you. Yeah, someone give him a microphone if you can. Okay, so very quickly, because we're limited for time, please keep your questions short.
You're the lucky one.
All right. My name is Angeline, and I'm from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So my question is, from what I see right now, maybe in Indonesia or some other part of the world as well, like with the rise of gig economy and everything like that, there are some people who actually choose to stay out of school because like maybe they think they can get better salary compared if they go to school and then like they find a job maybe in like company or somewhere else. And so I think there's a trend for some people to go on that side. Meanwhile, on the other hand, like if you want to work in a tech company, for instance, then you have to go for higher education and maybe just master even just like
Yeah.
another bachelor and stuff like that. So my question is, how does this threat be handled by the government? Because maybe it can lead to other issues as well. So.
Good question. Sorry, I have to cut you off. We'll get to that.
Thank you.
Let's get all the questions. Go ahead, quickly, sir.
Yes, so I'm Adnan from Morocco. My question is more not to you, but the crowd from IMF World Bank. Because the issue is macroeconomic policies. If governments don't understand that you need to change the paradigm, it's not about reforming education, it's about transforming the mindsets. So when the IMF and World Bank advise governments and give them policy recommendations on these elements, it needs to be included that it's part of the deal. Otherwise, no change can happen, and then we can repeat over and over again.
Okay. Wasn't a question, but thank you. Go ahead, sir. We'll come to you in a second. No, it's a great point. I don't mean to dismiss it, but I want to get questions.
That's right.
Who would like to address her question? Perhaps Zaki? Could you address her question?
Yeah, I think gig economy is a new wave right now when most of formal system going to informal right now. But I think the higher education is very important because if we only focus on gig economy usually a low value economic. If the country want to be advanced, we need innovation and we need education who invest a lot in innovation, something like that. And I think the government have to not only focus on the gig economy. Gig economy is in the bottom layer is important, yes, for creating jobs, but not make a company great, because the one who make a company big is innovation itself. For example, like you remember maybe Apple, US make Apple. When the Apple create a new product, for example, like Apple XS, the GDP growth of US is growing 0.2%. It's amazing products because they have innovation, and if we only focus on gig economy, we don't create value.
I'm gonna hear from Dr. Zulfa and Graham very quickly. 20 seconds.
2 sentences. Vocational training is one. For those who don't want to go to school, governments can support that, and it's becoming extremely important. And second is lifelong learning, not the kind of university lifelong learning, but all of us, no matter how much school you have, just primary school or university, we have to continue to learn all of our lives.
And Graham, anything to add?
That was exactly the point I was going to make about lifelong learning and technical and vocational education. But I would just add that I think that it's important that governments create the enabling environment to facilitate learning throughout the life cycle, and not to see higher education, university education, as a be-all and end-all. It's not a question of one size fits all in terms of needs of both employers and needs of employees.
Right.
And it's also, I think, very important to underscore that it's not just about going to university, it's about what you do there. And in many places around the world, the problem is that there are so many graduates of arts and social sciences and not enough graduates in the STEM subjects. And that's, obviously a policy that governments need to be aware of, to encourage more people to study STEM subjects.
Fantastic. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to sneak in some questions, please, very briefly.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. I'll be quick. The first, what type of soft skill that can be useful for youth at work area? And the second question, I want to directly ask to Mr. Ahmad Zaki. As you know, some of universities in Indonesia have a really outdated orientation program for the new student in the university. The senior will be yelled to the new student will be gathered at 3 p.m. in a work day, and sometimes they use physical punishment. The reason the senior do that, because it's really good for the soft skill in a work area. Is it true? Thank you.
Good questions. Zaki, why don't you start?
Yeah, maybe I answer the last question first.
Yeah.
Because I was experiencing that. When I was first time in ITB actually one of the most cultural, they have a very cultural tradition, something like that. So when you went to that campus, everyone like, bam, bam, bam.
Yeah.
Because you are an engineering student, something like that.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I feel sometimes it's very important. Sometimes it's important because it gathers solidarity.
Yeah.
Because that's the value of the campus. But there is also bad things because, for example, if ITB alumni join, being a minister, for example, the solidarity is there, and somehow it creates like lock-in. So they hire more ITB student, more ITB alumni, and then no diversity, and I see more bad things actually in that culture actually. So I say no to OSPEC actually.
Anyone who wants to answer his first question? Aya?
I can jump in. I'm not the advocate of skills, but I think access to knowledge without access to opportunity is an access to frustration. And there is a trend in Africa of teaching people coding, but people don't have laptops, so why are you teaching us coding? So for me, it's more, create spaces in our schools and our universities that are empowering for youth, that are nonviolent, that are non-misogynist, that are spaces where they can be and become. That's, I think, the most important for me.
Any other quick questions? This gentleman, right there. Thank you very much. Yes, the one in the back. Yes, yeah, he's been waiting. Sorry, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for this valuable chance. Let me introduce myself. I'm Andin from Genbi, a community of Bank Indonesia Scholarship Awardee. Based on previous article I have read, it is said that Indonesia will enter the period of demographic dividend from 2025 until 2030 approximately. We'll have a half dependency ratio, meaning that two productive people will have to take care one productive one. And my question is, in Indonesian case, which one should the youth focus on? Entrepreneurship or create jobs? Because entrepreneurship or improving the human capital through education, enrollment, which one should we focus on?
Thank you, thank you. Good question. Sorry, I have to cut you off.
Because this is kind of trade-off, because in developing region.
But don't answer the question. You asked the question. Let's let him answer. Could you answer, Zaki, perhaps? Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you?
Entrepreneurship or?
Enrollment.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Because this is kind of trade-off.
We got it. Thank you very much.
It's like a chicken and egg, right? I think when the chicken and egg, you cannot choose which one. We have to choose both of them together. Sorry?
Make an omelet.
Yeah, I think entrepreneurship is more important because while you do a building business, usually you learn something, and then I don't know. I feel like in Indonesia itself, we have less company for a new graduate to learn. If you look at the U.S. or big country, usually they have a lot of big companies. So the new graduate, we have a very good university in Indonesia, but I feel like they don't have a chance to work at a very big and innovative company, for example. I think that's the big gap especially in Indonesia. I saw that gap. We need more big company to young generation to learn, to gain the demographic dividend, I think.
And we're going to give the last comment to the man with the most full brain, apparently. Go ahead.
I don't think that's the case. But just to pick up on that question, I think that there's often a dilemma about creating entrepreneurs or creating workers, faced by government. I don't think it's really a substantive dilemma because I think that every economy needs a combination of both. I think it's often more sexy or more attractive to think of entrepreneurship and promoting entrepreneurship.
Right.
But we have to face the facts that not everybody can be or wants to be an entrepreneur.
Right.
So I think it's also very important that governments create the right enabling environments for people to be workers. So it's a question of a balanced approach to ensuring that the labour markets function well.
Fantastic. So anything to add very quickly?
I was just going to say, not everybody should be an entrepreneur. Some people want to actually be employed, and entrepreneurship does create jobs. So if there's a good base of entrepreneurship, you will have more employed people.
Most certainly. And, we had a lot of questions on Twitter. I do want to wrap up this session. Hopefully it was a compelling conversation and instructive for all of you. Ben Munns, who tweeted, Ben, are you here? Raise your hand. Oh, he's not here. He must be watching, or perhaps he is. I can't see his hand. But anyway, he's an Australian youth delegate to the 2018 World Bank. He summed up this conversation very well. He said on Twitter, tech disruption, the gig economy, finding purpose, the role of education, I can't count, supporting entrepreneurship are all on discussion and during the IMF Youth at Work. So that's, I think, some of the takeaways that we learned today. I want to thank our panelists for their expertise, and also, quite frankly, for sharing your personal stories. I think that's always something that we all will leave here, remembering. And thank you to the IMF, thank you to everybody, and I hope you enjoyed this panel. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. You're amazing.
For those who have already de-mic'd,